All right, let's jump right in. Today we're looking at Glencore, and wow, this company is everywhere. We're talking about the materials in our phones, keeping the lights on in our cities, even stuff in the steel for bridges.
It is amazing just how big Glencore is, right? And they're not just digging up raw materials, they're trading them globally, connecting producers and consumers. It's intricate.
So it's kind of a tangled web, right?
Right.
The report says Glencore does marketing and industrial activities. What exactly are those?
Think of marketing like the ultimate middleman, buying, selling, transporting commodities all over the place. They use market changes, and they're experts at knowing global supply and demand,
Hmm.
really facilitating where those raw materials need to go.
So they're matching up the commodity world.
Yeah, exactly. But then there's industrial activities, and this is where they really, get their hands dirty. This is where they're extracting and processing those commodities. Copper mines in South America, they have coal operations in Australia, zinc and nickel mines all over the globe.
Wow, that's a massive scope. The report shows Glencore is huge in copper, cobalt, zinc, nickel, coal, even oil and gas. Their production numbers. They're one of the biggest producers in the world for many of these. They actually control something like 3% of global copper production. That's like enough copper to build electric grids for entire countries.
It's wild, isn't it? And it gets even more interesting when you think about how they're setting themselves up for the future. They talk a lot about supplying transition enabling commodities. That means things that are super important for a low carbon economy, right? Things like copper for electric vehicles and building out that grid infrastructure needed for renewable energy.
But they're not ditching coal anytime soon, are they? The report is careful to explain the difference between thermal coal for power and steelmaking coal, which they say is vital for building stuff, even if everything goes renewable.
Yeah, that's a tough spot to be in for sure. It's like they're walking this tightrope. Their long-term plan relies on supplying those metals needed for decarbonization, but they've also got to manage how their thermal coal business winds down. It's a tricky balance.
Speaking of balancing acts, let's talk about money. So 2022 was record-breaking for them, but 2023 seems more, normal. Their adjusted EBITDA is $17.1 billion.
Right. So to be clear, EBITDA is basically how profitable their operations are. Think of it like the cash a business gets from its main work, before you factor in things like debt payments and taxes. Now, $17.1 billion dollars is a lot lower than 2022's $34.1 billion.
Yeah.
But 2022 was weird. Remember, commodity prices went through the roof because of the war in Ukraine and all the supply chain issues after the pandemic.
This is more like things settling down. But it's still one of their best years in the last decade, right? And their net debt, meaning how much money they owe, that went down a lot, down to $4.9 billion. That's impressive, especially since they spent $3.7 billion on share buybacks.
Right, share buybacks. That's when a company buys back its own shares. It can
Hmm.
make the remaining shares worth more. It's a way to give value back to the shareholders, basically saying, we're so confident in our company, we're buying part of it back.
That's putting your money where your mouth is. And then there are the dividends. The report mentions a base cash distribution of 2013 cents per share for 2023. That adds up to a huge $1.6 billion. They really seem to want to keep investors happy.
Absolutely, yeah. It's clear what their plan is with money: reward those shareholders, manage debt carefully, and keep looking for chances to grow, especially in those transition-enabling commodities we were talking about.
And they're not shy about growth. They're planning this big acquisition, Elk Valley Resources.
Yeah.
If that goes through, it'll boost their steelmaking coal production by a lot. That's a pretty big bet on something a lot of people are moving away from.
Definitely. If it happens, this EVR acquisition, their steelmaking coal production will go way up. It seems to say they think this part of the coal market still has potential, even though everyone's talking about getting rid of carbon.
So we've talked business, we've talked financials, and we've talked about how Glencore is trying to balance the old commodities with this changing world. But what about sustainability? How is Glencore addressing all those concerns about the impact they have, on the environment and society?
It's a huge part of their business now, especially with investors and just like everyone wanting to know what companies are doing about environmental and social stuff, the whole ESG thing.
Right. Are companies actually doing stuff, or are they just saying they are?
Right.
So what about Glencore? Are they really trying to be more sustainable?
Oh, yeah, they're making some changes for sure. A big one is cutting their emissions from their operations. Their goal is to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions, those are the ones directly from their operations and energy use, by 15% by 2026. And get this, a whole 50% by 2035. They're comparing that to what they were doing in 2019.
Wow, those are some ambitious targets. But how do they plan to actually do that? Like actually make the changes to hit those goals? It's easy to say it, but harder to do it.
They're trying a bunch of things, investing in renewable energy to power their operations, being more energy efficient, to use less energy overall. They're even looking at carbon capture and storage, trapping those emissions before they get into the atmosphere.
That's a lot. But what about the emissions that happen when their products are used? Those Scope 3 emissions we talked about, those are often a way bigger piece of the emissions pie.
Oh, they're working on that too. It's trickier. It means working with all their customers and partners in the whole supply chain, but they're trying to come up with low carbon solutions with everyone and encourage better practices across their industries.
So what's that look like in the real world? How are they helping their customers cut their own emissions?
Well, take copper, for example.
Yeah.
Glencore is a huge copper supplier, and copper is crucial for all that stuff, electric vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, making the electric grid more efficient. By giving those industries good copper, they're helping the world switch to lower carbon tech, even though at the same time they're still making and selling fossil fuels.
So they're kind of playing both sides, huh? It's got to be a tricky place to be.
Totally. They know that going green isn't going to happen overnight. The world still runs on fossil fuels, and Glencore is a big part of that. But they're also saying they want to be a major supplier for those materials we'll need for a more sustainable future.
They keep talking about a just and orderly energy transition. What does that even mean, for Glencore and the communities they work in?
It's important, right, that they're acknowledging that moving away from fossil fuels has to be done carefully. You don't want to mess up economies or make things unfair for people. So you have to think about the workers in the fossil fuel industry, the communities that depend on those jobs, and the countries that need the money from fossil fuels.
So it's more than just cutting emissions. It's about making sure the switch is smooth and fair so no one gets left behind. How do they put that into action, though? What are they actually doing for a just transition?
Well, they're putting money into training programs to help workers learn new skills for green jobs. They're working with governments and communities to figure out how to diversify economies in places that really rely on fossil fuels. And they're talking to different groups, stakeholders, to make sure their plans include everyone and address everyone's needs.
Sounds like they're trying a bunch of different things, which is good. But let's talk about something else important for sustainability responsible sourcing. Glencore operates in some pretty tough places, right? Places with a lot of risk of human rights issues, environmental damage, even corruption. How are they dealing with that, making sure things are done ethically and responsibly?
Oh, they know about those risks, and they're working on it. They have a human rights policy based on the UN guidelines for businesses and human rights. And they're following the voluntary principles on security and human rights. Those give guidance on how to manage security without abusing human rights.
Okay, that's good. But policies are one thing, right? What about actually doing it? How are they making sure these principles are followed out there in their operations?
Well, they have a whole system for spotting, assessing, and handling human rights risks in everything they do. They do checks on their suppliers and contractors, they talk to local communities and listen to their concerns, and they have ways for people to report violations and investigate them. Plus, they publish reports on their human rights performance pretty often.
So they're trying to be proactive and open about all of that. Now, what about protecting the environment? How are they keeping their impact low, especially in delicate ecosystems?
They have a whole environmental policy, too, outlining their commitments to minimizing their impact. They've got strong environmental management systems in place. Before starting any new project, they do environmental impact assessments. And they keep a close eye on their operations to make sure they're following all the environmental rules. They're even putting money into technologies and ways of working that reduce water use, minimize waste, and protect biodiversity.
It seems like they're trying to make sustainability a core part of how they do business, not just some extra thing they tack on.
That's the idea, definitely. They're realizing that being sustainable isn't just about doing good, it makes good business sense too. Investors are looking for companies that do well on ESG, and customers want products that are made responsibly.
So they're trying to balance making money with being responsible. But are they actually doing it? How can we tell how they're really doing on all this?
Yeah, that's where it gets harder. Sustainability reporting is kind of a new thing, and there's no standard way to do it. Glencore shares a lot of data on their environmental and social performance, but it's tough to tell what's real progress and what's just, trying to sound good.
It's one thing to set goals and talk about stuff, but what's really happening out there? How are they measuring their progress and making sure it's accurate?
Those are the important questions. And investors and stakeholders are asking those questions more and more. Everyone wants more standardized ESG reporting that can be audited, so companies can be held accountable for what they say.
So while they are doing stuff, there's definitely room for them to be more transparent and accountable.
Right, it's a process, and it's something we'll be keeping an eye on. But it's also important to remember that Glencore, like a lot of companies in this industry, they're working in a really complicated and tough environment. They've got a lot of different people wanting different things, and the world's changing fast.
It's all a balancing act, and it's one we'll be watching.
Okay, let's take a step back for a second and think about what we've learned. We've looked at all their different business parts, their financials, which are strong, but maybe a bit shaky, how they're planning to make money for shareholders, and how their approach to sustainability is changing.
It's fascinating, right? This global commodities giant trying to deal with all the challenges and opportunities of a world that's changing so much.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, let's talk about their long-term strategy. How are they setting themselves up for the future with all this uncertainty in the commodity market and everyone wanting them to address climate change?
That's where it gets really interesting. All right, so we're back, wrapping up our look at Glencore. We've gone through their business, their numbers, and how they're trying to make things work with this whole sustainability thing.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. It really shows how much this one company is connected to, like, everything, right? Our phones, the energy we use, it's all there.
And now we're thinking about the future, right? How is Glencore going to deal with the crazy commodity market and all the pressure to go green?
Well, it's tricky. They're at a real crossroads, facing both good and bad. On the one hand, they're still a big player in fossil fuels, especially coal.
And remember, they're actually planning to get even bigger in steel-making coal if they buy Elk Valley Resources. That's a bold move when the whole world seems to be turning away from coal.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? But they're also pushing this idea that they supply those transition-enabling commodities, the metals and minerals that we'll need to build a cleaner future, right? Copper for EV charging stations, all that grid infrastructure we need for renewable energy.
So they're trying to do both. Stick with the old and jump into the new.
Kind of, yeah. And it's a real balancing act. Look, the world needs fossil fuels right now, even as we try to switch to clean energy. And Glencore says they can be that bridge, providing both the old stuff and the new stuff we'll need for a low-carbon economy.
It's a risky plan. There's a ton of pressure from investors and activists who want them to ditch fossil fuels faster. And some people say what they're doing with renewables just isn't enough if they're still big on coal and oil.
That's a fair point. Glencore needs to prove they're really serious about sustainability, not just trying to cover all the bases. They need to show it, not just say it. Set clear goals for lowering their emissions, put money into cleaner technologies, and start phasing out the stuff that pollutes the most.
That's a lot to ask. But Glencore has the money and the reach, global reach, to make a difference. The question is, will they actually do it?
Yeah, that's the big question. The next few years will be really important for Glencore as they figure out how to handle all this pressure. They've got to show they're committed to sustainability, and not just with words. They need real action, stuff that can be measured so everyone knows it's real.
So Glencore's future really comes down to whether they can adapt, right? Change with the world. They need to show investors, regulators, everyone, that they're serious about sustainability and that they can be part of making things better, making a low-carbon future.
Well, this deep dive has really shown us what's going on inside this massive commodities company, hasn't it? We've seen their strengths, but also the things that might make them vulnerable.
And it's a story that's still going. There's a lot more to come. What will Glencore become? Will they be the company that held on to the past or the one that helped build the future?
That's the question we leave you with today. As you see what Glencore does next, think about the choices they make, what they actually do, and how it affects everything around us.
It's about more than just what they produce, right? It's about the future they're helping create. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Glencore.